Yes, that's correct. Thank you so much for having me again. So let me remind you that I spent like 3 years ago now, I spent 15 beautiful months here, the best months in my academic life and potentially my whole life. And it's so great that I see familiar faces again and some new ones. What am I doing here? I am visiting you again because one of the papers I published back then won an award in THEMA, so they just told me, you can come around and take a second look, and this is why I'm doing this, and I'm very thankful that I am given the opportunity to present my recent work, and also I'm given a place to stay. Thanks also for that, and I really appreciate your interest and you being here to follow this theme. Okay, so this stuff is very different from the stuff that I was doing when I was here. And by the way, for the directors, that stuff is published, and it just got published. I emailed you about that in case you need to know. Okay, the paper is out. This paper is something that I started like a year and a half ago, and unfortunately, the inspiration is not particularly pleasant. So the paper is the title of the paper is Investment Under Uncertainty and the Threat of Nationalization, and my inspiration was the attack of Russia in Ukraine. So what happened during that period is that, particularly since the February of 2022, which is like 3 years ago now, 3 years and a half, what happened is that the Russian parliament allowed or passed legislation allowing the state to nationalize assets of foreign companies. So the point here was that the European Union was setting retaliation measures against Russia, and Russia was retaliating on its own. And the retaliation was about nationalizing assets of foreign companies. I have some examples here. The point was that there were firms, multinational firms active in the Russian market, and they have seen their assets being nationalized. And this happened in different sectors. So, for instance, in energy, in food and beverages, so particularly about Carlsberg, there were many reports in the news, like Carlsberg wanted to leave the Russian market early on. They didn't manage to do it. Same situation in manufacturing. So clearly there was this bad episode of firms not managing to leave early on and seeing their assets being nationalized, basically. Of course, nationalization is not a recent phenomenon, and perhaps before talking about nationalization, I should define it. So nationalization basically has to do with me as a multinational company being active in a foreign country and then seeing the conditions under which I operate change. So basically, this can be the local dictator just comes and gets my company from me, my factory or whatever, or perhaps there are also other types of nationalizations, one of which is the so-called creeping expropriation, which is not about changing of property. So the local dictator just gets my plant. It's about, look, Dimitrios, come and invest in our country and the tax rate will be 5%. And then 10 years later, look, Dimitrios, bad news for you. Now the tax rate is 20%. This is not about changing of ownership, but it's about still changing the conditions under which one company operates in a foreign country. Again, of course, this is not new stuff. So nationalization has been very popular or very important to study since the 70s, 80s, again back in the 90s. And what makes nationalization, I think, an interesting topic is the following thing. So if I want to go and invest in a foreign country, clearly there is something for me in this investment. I will make money out of it. I will also offer something to the locals. But at the same time, there is this nationalization threat, which is bad. And there is clearly a balance that can be found where I invest, even if the threat is in place. So we have seen multinational corporations willing to invest abroad, even if the threat is present, right? So the question here is, if the environment that you're going to invest in is not particularly safe, why do you do it? So why the balance is good in the very end for you? So the question that I'm asking in this paper is how the threat of nationalization affects the timing and scale of investments. And again, the inspiration here was news reports from 3 years ago where economists were asked, how do you think that these nationalization events will change the way firms invest? And this is basically what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to understand how the nationalization threat is affecting the way I'm investing. Do I invest earlier? Do I invest later? Do I never invest? Do I invest in a bigger plant, in a smaller plant? What do I do? And in fact, the findings of the paper are found in the second bullet. What I show in the paper is that if nationalization is cheaper for the local government, so it is not very costly for them to take my business from me, then I will push for a smaller investment, but a smaller investment is less expensive to undertake, so I will go in and do it earlier, which is a bit counterintuitive, because what I'm telling you now is if the threat is higher, I invest earlier. This doesn't make sense at first sight. But what I'm arguing here in this paper is that if the threat is high, I will go and invest in a less mature market, in a less mature project, and such a project does not require very good conditions, so I can do it earlier. So if we see this type of behavior, like investors appearing in markets, in companies, in industries, even that are under great threat of nationalization, this does not mean that these people are tolerant against political risk. It might just mean that they are going for smaller projects that are less expensive to invest in, and this eventually might be seen as tolerance, right? So again, the message here is that the presence of investors in high-risk environments should not be treated as evidence of tolerance against political risk. Instead, it might merely suggest investments presenting important scale and time distortions. So again, if it is very unsure, the environment that I am willing to invest in, I'm going for a smaller investment than I should, but this is cheaper to undertake, so I will do it earlier. This is the point that I'm trying to communicate. Okay. If you do not have comments or questions about the main idea, the main story, the main question and stuff, I will give a very quick presentation of the mathematics in the paper. The point is not to tire you with that, but I will just try to describe you how I reached these conclusions. So the paper presents a game between two parties. So there is one party, which is the multinational corporation, and there is another party, which is the host country, right? So there are these two people, or two agents, and they need to decide how to manage the project that is at hand. So the project is characterized by this equation number one, which basically says that the more money I put in my project, the more stuff the project will produce when it is active, but at a decreasing rate. So this is an increasing and concave function. This is very standard. It just says that the more I invest, the better, the bigger the plant becomes, but again, the rate of increase is smaller. In order to undertake this investment, I need to spend this I of A. This is an investment cost, and it's linear in the capital intensity. So basically, I need to build something. This something has an investment cost that I need to pay. And once the project is operational, it will start to make money for me. And the money it makes per unit of capacity is captured by this pi t. So this formula here basically captures the ups and downs in the demand that I might face in the future, and says basically that per unit of QA, so let's say you build a plant with capacity 10 units, then you can count on 10 times pi t, where pi t is again the demand. So again, in order to sum up, two players, multinational corporation and host country, a project, the size of the project is QA, A is the amount of money I'm putting into it, IA of A is the investment cost, and the demand that I am going to gain access to when I invest is stochastic because of the ups and downs in the local market. Okay. Now, what happens if I invest? So I assume that as soon as I invest, the flow, which is Q of A times pi t, is split between the two parties. So the host country is getting a share of the profits, and the rest of the profits is going to the investor. So in fact, theta times QA times pi t is the amount of money that goes to the investor, and 1 minus theta times QA times pi t is the amount of money that goes to the host country. So basically, assume that once the investment is in place, some of the money goes into the pocket of the investor, and some of the money goes into the pocket of the government as a tax rate, for instance, right? And then at some point in the future, things will change and the project will be nationalized. And nationalization here means two things. So the first thing is that something will change in the way we split the profits, and this will be to the benefit of the local government. So instead of 1 minus theta times QA times pi t, we will go to 1 minus S times theta times QA times pi t, so something bigger. And instead, the rest will remain with the investor. So imagine again the story of I'm going to a foreign country, I invest in a project, the tax rate is 10%, and then things change in the future because my project is nationalized, and then I'm taxed with 20%. So initially I was gaining 90% of the money, now I'm gaining only 80% of the money. Of course, I can use the same model to model something very extreme, so full expropriation. You come and you take all the projects from me, and that's it. Now, nationalization is not without cost, so it's costly. And I know that a government does not need to pay anything when it nationalizes because it's a government, so they rule the country. But what happens frequently is that there are costs in terms of reputation, there are costs in terms of trade embargoes, there are costs in terms of loss of future investments. So if I nationalize your project, future investors will say, okay, but this country is not very safe, so I will skip it. And this is costly for me. Or at the same time, if, again, if I nationalize your project, perhaps the other country will not do business with me in the future again. And the nationalization cost is assumed again to be an increasing function of the size of the investment and a concave one. And the point here is that the bigger the investment, the more expensive it should be for the government to nationalize, right? So if I have a small kiosk and the local dictator comes and takes the kiosk from me, then perhaps the cost for this person is not particularly big. Instead, if I have a very big plant, like again, a Carlsberg or Ariston production plant, then nationalization is costlier for this person because, again, the plant is bigger, okay? Okay, so this is basically the story here. Both parties discount with the same discount rate. So the point is that, again, we have a game that evolves in, over time. So there will be flows of money, and I need to discount for that. And the last bullet here basically describes the relationship between the two parties. And the relationship is as follows. So we first choose together what is the size of the plant. So we bargain, we negotiate, and we choose what A I should invest in. So let's say it's Greece and France, or no, it's Dimitrios and France, and we choose together to invest in a plant that costs 1 billion euros. I put the 1 billion euros, and the plant starts operating. And then at some point in the future, France can actually nationalize the project, paying the corresponding cost. Why should France do it? Because perhaps my plant is very valuable, right? I produce something that has a very high value, and you say, look, it doesn't make sense to respect the initial contract, forget about it, I'm going and I'm taking the project from you. So this is the whole story, okay? Okay, so as usual, these games are studied backwards, so we assume that the agreement has been made, the project is already in place, and then we go to the very, very last stage and we study first the nationalization. But before I do that, I would like to give you an idea about how the values for the two parties look like. Again, the point is not about the mathematics, but about describing what is going on. I understand that these are relatively ugly, but at the same time, they are very clear. So the first ugly formula says that basically this is the value for the host country. And it basically says that at some point in the future, the market is big enough for the investment to take place. And this is this TI over there. And the investment takes place, the host country starts cashing the taxes, which is 1 minus theta times QA times pi t. I remind you that 1 minus theta is the share of the project I'm cashing as the government. QA is the size of the plant, and pi t is the money that the plant makes per unit of QA. So we have this first integral which says that, okay, from the time point I invest up to the time point you take my project from me, or you nationalize in any case, I make, or you make a certain amount of money. Then at some point in the future, and this point in the future is this Tn, you exercise the nationalization option and you pay this N of A over there, and you change the conditions under which we basically interact. And instead of 1 minus theta, you start cashing 1 minus S times theta times QA times pi t. So basically, again, the point is that at some point in the future, you find my project very attractive, and you say, okay, forget it, I'm paying the nationalization cost, and I am changing the conditions under which we operate. And this then goes on up to infinity. In a similar fashion, we can compute the value for the multinational corporation. So the multinational corporation needs to pay the investment cost, I of A. And then as soon as this is done, a flow of profits starts from TI up to TN, and this flow of profits is basically the amount of money I make with the original conditions. And then at TN, you reduce my flow by nationalizing my project, no matter if this means full expropriation or if this means, again, changing just the conditions, and this is the case up to infinity. And again, here I describe what this TI and TN is. The point here is that since the demand for the thing that I am producing is evolving over time, I cannot compute the investment time point or the nationalization time point. But what I can do is compute the conditions under which it makes sense for me to invest and equivalently for you to nationalize. So it is something like, let's say that I'm producing in your country, I don't know, aluminium. The point here is that I cannot tell you that I will invest in this aluminium plant in 10 years, but what I can tell is that I will invest in the aluminium plant as soon as the price of aluminium per kilo reaches this level. So this I can do. And in an equivalent fashion, as soon as the investment takes place and a certain level of aluminium price is reached, then you can set as the host country an even higher price level where you will say, okay, the guy will invest if the aluminium per kilo reaches 100 euros, but then as soon as 120 euros are reached, now it's my turn. So this is why the TI and TN are connected with this pi t, okay? Okay, now these are the values for the two parties. Again, the first has to do with the host country, the other one has to do with the multinational corporation. And given this, we can start studying the interaction between these two parties backwards and see how they behave. So again, imagine that the plant is in place, the investment has taken place, so there is a flow that is already in place again. And now it's my turn, I'm the host country, to choose what to do with your plant. By when should I nationalize it? And the point here is that the value of the nationalization option, basically for me, it's like this. This is the formula I have shown before, basically, but rewritten. And it says that for a period of time, we operate with business as usual, and then things will change in the future once you nationalize my project. And the only new term in this formula is this vita, which is basically accounting for the stochastics and the dynamics in the model. Now, if we maximize this with respect to pi n, we obtain this threshold I was describing. So we find the optimal nationalization threshold, where basically what I'm saying here is that as soon as the price or the profit flow reaches this level, it is optimal for the foreign country to come and steal my project, okay, come and nationalize. Usually the audience is relatively confused at this point because they are telling me, but look, Dimitrios, you are modeling nationalization as purely a financial decision or an economics decision. Nationalization is not necessarily that. And indeed, this is true. So frequently nationalization is something that does not have to do with the markets, but it has to do with the political situation. Absolutely, yes. So this is correct, and I totally agree with that. And yet we have evidence that it's much more threatening to be nationalized when prices of the thing that you are selling, they are high enough. So if I am, for instance, if I'm managing an oil well and I'm pumping up oil and the price of oil is very high, then the threat of you nationalizing my oil well is much higher, because what I'm doing basically is very beneficial, it's very profitable, and you want to take it from me, okay? So I understand that this is basically, or potentially, one side of the story. It's only the economics, but the economics are important in this kind of cases, right? So nationalization, of course, has to do with other things that happen in societies, but the economic part is also important. Now, what we can see in this formula, again, the nationalization threshold is basically that if it is very expensive, so if NA is high, it's very expensive for the local dictator to come and take my plant, the local dictator will wait a long time to do it. So if basically the host country is a very safe country and the nationalization cost is very high, nationalization will happen in the very far future where the thing that I'm doing is super profitable. And at the same time, we see this term in the denominator here, which basically says that if the plant is very attractive, I'm going to take it from you earlier, which I think makes sense. Okay, so these two forces are basically determining when the nationalization threshold is reached. Now, in a similar fashion, we can treat the investment option. So again, similar story. I need to pay AI, so the investment cost. This investment cost gives me access to a flow of profits. Again, imagine if I am taxed with 5%, then 95% of the money stays in my pocket, and I can count for that for the time period before you change the rules of the game, and then at some point you will change the rules of the game, and this is why we have this 1 minus n, 1 minus s, blah, 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 in the parentheses. And again, the story here is similar. The only new term is this vita, and this vita accounts for discounting and the dynamics in this framework, which is stochastic, again, and dynamic. And again, we can compute the optimal investment threshold here, which, as before, this says basically, if I am producing aluminum or beers or television sets, how high the profitability of this should be for me to go and build this plant, knowing that at some point in the future, you might come and steal it from me. Now, if you see this formula here, you will notice that, again, it is a formula depending on the investment cost. So, of course, if I need to build a car plant in your company, in your country, and the price of this plant is very high, it will take me a lot of time for me to do it. And at the same time, if the money that I'm going to make out of it is very good, then I will come and do it early. But the important thing in this formula, if you ask me, is that this formula is not a function of N or S. I remind you that N is the nationalization cost, and S is the damage because of the nationalization. So what I am arguing here is that if you need to make an investment in a foreign country under the nationalization threat, the conditions that need to hold for the investment to take place are not affected by the nationalization cost or the amount of money you will get once the nationalization takes place, which again is a bit counterintuitive. Like, if it is very expensive for the local dictator to come and take my plant from me, shouldn't this affect my investment timing? And yet in the paper, I show that the timing itself is not affected, but the value of the project is affected. So the market conditions that need to hold are not related to the nationalization cost, but whether the plant makes sense for you or not is something that is affected, even if I don't show it here. Now, the nationalization threat does not seem to affect when I invest, but as you can see, the investment threshold, this PI, is pi I. It's a function of A. It's a function of the size of the investment. But the size of the investment is chosen by the two parties, and it's a function of the nationalization cost, as we will see in a little bit. So through that, also the investment cost will be affected. So we have seen the nationalization, we have seen the investment. Now let's go to the very last stage of this game, where basically before anything happens, the two parties agree how big the plant should be. So how much money should I, the investor, put in it? In order to identify that, we use the Nash bargaining product here. Basically, this is a very standard way to model bargaining in economics. You have power, I have power, we bargain, and depending on our powers, we drive the result this way or the other way. Okay, and the powers are this P and Q over there. H is the value for the host country, M is the value for the multinational corporation, P and Q are the relative bargaining powers. Of course, if I am very powerful when we bargain, I will do whatever I want. And if you are very powerful, you will do whatever you want, okay? So if we maximize this thing, we find that A star, so the capital intensity that maximizes the result of the bargaining balance, is given by this formula, and there are many parameters, I guess, in here. What matters is the way N and S affect A star. Basically, what this formula says is that if N is very high, so if it is very costly for you to nationalize me, so if the environment is very safe, I will go for a bigger plant. At the same time, if S is very high, which means that you cannot do a lot of damage to me after the nationalization, again, A is becoming higher. So what I'm basically saying here is that if the environment is very safe, both parties will push for a bigger plant, so something that is more mature. But this A star, as we have seen earlier, appears in the threshold for the investment. And in the very end, if we plug in this A star in the nationalization threshold and the investment threshold, we will see that while changes in N and S do not affect pi I directly, there is an indirect effect passing through A star. And this basically takes us back to the main idea of the paper. The idea is that an increase in the nationalization cost is reflected in a higher nationalization threshold. So if it's very costly for you, the local dictator, to come and take my project from me, you will do it later. This implies a safer period of operations for me. And since I can operate safely for a longer period of time, I will push for a larger project. But a larger project is more expensive to make. So I will wait longer before I actually make it because I want the local conditions to be more mature. Or the other way around, if the nationalization threat is significant, then the investment will be exercised in expected terms earlier. So again, the point is that if it is very likely that you will come and take my project from me soon, I will still invest in it, but it will be very small. And if it is very small, I don't need the conditions to be amazing before I invest, so I will do it earlier. But this is not evidence of me being in favor of this uncertainty, of this threat. Okay. There are some numerical results in the paper. I will try to focus on the more interesting ones. And I guess these are the ones. So what am I plotting here? We have two panels. The panel on the left plots H and M. I remind you that H is the value for the host country, so the local dictator again. And M is the value for the potential investor, which is me. Okay? And this eta that we have on the horizontal axis, this is the balance between the bargaining power of the two parties. So if eta is very small, this means that all the bargaining power belongs to the investor. And if eta is very high, this means that all the bargaining power belongs to the local dictator. So what we can see here is basically that, first of all, the project is much more profitable for the local government, for the host country, than for the investor. So the black line is always much higher than the dotted line. And the point here is that I build the plant, I benefit from it for a bit of time, but then you come and change the conditions and you benefit from it forever. So it's the project is much more valuable for you. And we also see that as the bargaining power balance shifts, not in favor of me, the investor, but in favor of the dictator, the value of the investor goes down significantly. The value of the host country goes up, but very slightly, which basically means that if there is a nationalization threat, the loss in terms of value is very significant if all the bargaining power goes to the host country. Okay, so the second panel has to do with the same two curves. So again, we have the value for the host country and the value for the multinational corporation. And theta, I remind you, is the amount of money I get from the project initially. I'm the investor. So let's say if we agree that the tax rate is 5%, my theta would be 95, right? 95%, and you would get 0.5. So let's see how this affects the relationship. So if theta is 0, this basically means that the investor takes next to nothing in the beginning. And as you can see, if you give me next to nothing, I will not invest. So the value is 0. But also, if I get nothing, I'm never investing. So your value is also equal to 0. So that's why the two curves meet at 0 on the left. And then we see that as theta increases, so as the share becomes larger and larger, things are better for the multinational corporation. So it's an increasing function. Of course, if you give me a larger share, I'm better off. But as you can see, the curve for the host country is concave. So basically, what this curve says is that it is best for the local dictator or for the host country to give initially to the potential investor something like 62% of the flow. So if I promise you a big amount of money in the beginning, around 62%, things are better for you. You will be, my value will be larger. Instead, for instance, if I just give you 40% or 30%. And then it goes down again, even if I promise you all the flow, you still get much more than what happens if you get 0 in the beginning. Okay. Why is this important? Why I think this is interesting, again, I'm trying to gain your attention here, is because of the following. In the news, very frequently you ask stuff like the following. This country or this state in the United States is promising 0 taxes to these potential investors. So they are giving everything. The incentives are very high. Why is that? So basically here, as you can see, if you give only a 10% theta or a 20% theta, things are not optimal. What would be optimal for the host country would be to give something like 62%, because if you give that much, you manage to attract the foreign investor so that this person invests in you. Even if because of competition, you need to give almost everything in the beginning, so if you are close to theta equal to 1, things are still okay for you because initially you get nothing from this project. You give everything to the investor, but you keep on your hand the option to nationalize the project at some point and change the balance later on. So again, I consider this numerical finding, this is not analytically done numerically, but I think this is somewhat interesting, again, because it shows why regions, states, countries seem to be so willing to give incentives, high incentives for foreign investors. Okay, so summing up relatively quickly, I guess, but I think this is okay. This paper asks, how does the threat of nationalization affect the timing and scale of an investment? And what I show here is that the higher the nationalization risk, the bigger the damage in terms of underinvestment, in terms of timing and scale. So again, my point is that if it is very risky for me to come and invest in your industry or your country or whatever, I will push for a smaller project. But a smaller project is cheaper to invest in, so I'm going to do it earlier. But this does not mean that I like the threat. It is just me reacting to the threat. The originality in the paper is that I am explicitly considering the scale as the negotiation variable. So as you have seen, and I assume here that the two parties negotiate regarding how big the plant should be. And this is in fact something that happens frequently in this type of investments. Even if an earlier work, like 12 years ago, this colleague studied a similar model where the variable of interest was the theta. So how we should share the money that the project makes initially. And about future work, I guess one obvious point that one can do is add here the politics. So of course, this is not only about money. Politics matter. I totally agree. Another thing that is important in the literature is the following that I didn't know about. And there is a reference in the literature about France and some African countries. And the story was as follows. So in the past, the local African government was kicking out the French and was nationalizing the project. But very quickly after that, they were noticing that they cannot actually operate the project, and they were shutting it down. So there is an extra cost of nationalization, which is like, okay, I go and I take Sokena's project. I try to operate it, but it happens that she had know-how that I do not. So I end up closing it down, and this damages the people in my country. So there is something that can be said about consumer surplus and nationalization in this respect, so that if I come and take your plant, there is no guarantee that I can operate it as well as you did. Okay, and this is not in the paper. So this was it. If you have any comments or questions, I would be more than happy to hear them.